for our first speaker, Karl.
All right, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. So I'm going to first introduce myself. My name is Karl Bahceci. I was born on actually the day of the next Nerd Night. So that's my birthday. So I'm originally from the city where Nerd Night began, New York City. And I currently work in the Fukuoka City Hall and Convention Bureau. And basically I help with, analyzing tourist information, bunseki, basic variety of stuff, laundry list stuff. But that notwithstanding, my job has absolutely nothing to do with what I study. So I'm really eager to launch into this definitely nerdy philosophy and personality types presentation. So my overall goal today is to show what connection Jungian personality types have with broader metaphysical themes concerning reality. So to put this in more simple terms, I'm just trying to connect ideas about how reality is together with what people know today as personality types. So I'll get into those more later, but this is the phi symbol for, oh, what did I do? Did I press the wrong button?
Press that one.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. Yeah, so phi for metaphysics and C for psychology. These are Greek characters. So going forward, what is metaphysics first of all? Because this is a big term to unpack. So metaphysics is the study of the ultimate nature of reality. It's basically the study of whatever is not included in physics. And this is what Aristotle, the father of the subject, designed it to be. So if, for example, if physics deals with the way that physical properties and laws are organized, metaphysics has to do with whatever is not discussed there. So what causes those things? Things that are beyond the physical world and may not be able to be calculated. So the funny part, though, is that the word name in Greek just literally means after physics. Because in the library, it just came after the book physics. So they just didn't know what to call it. So it's after physics. So that's what metaphysics basically is. The second part of my presentation, though, is the idea of personality types. So this is maybe a little more close at hand to all of us here. Personality type is the theory of how people differ in roughly categorizable ways. So how I might act versus someone else might act in, roughly speaking, predictable or typological ways. So we differ in ways that you can categorize. That's the study of this. For example, some people we call extroverted, some people we call introverted, or naikosha to gaikosha no chigai toka. So there are many different systems within personality typology. So we have the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the Big Five type indicator, and even Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. These can all roughly be called personality theories, I guess you could say. And I'm going to be mostly dealing with Myers-Briggs now for sake of ease. But I'll get into some of the other ones. So I'm going to be talking about Jungian personality type today. And Jung was a Swiss psychotherapist, and he was a student of Sigmund Freud, and originally styled as his inheritor of his legacy. That is until they started disagreeing and Freud disowned him, and actually passed out at a conference when he made a comment about fathers in ancient Egypt. So they didn't have a very good split. It was very acrimonious. But today I'm going to focus on his theory of personality typology, because even though he's the father of many other theories. So first things first, we don't need to answer this all at once because it'll take time, but how many people know their MBTI type, which is this, all right? How many people know what each of the letters in these codes stand for? All right, yeah. And then the last question, I guess, is how many people know what these two characters stand for, these SE, FI things? Those are just questions I'm positing for everyone's here. So I'm going to get into this a little bit more now. For Jung, type goes deeper than how you merely behave. That's a very crucial distinction. It goes down to the root of all your experiences, which is how we're going to get into the philosophy here. So let's get digging right now. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the idea of orientation in Jungian psychology. When we call someone an extrovert or introvert, that is what orientation means. So it basically has to do with how I orient myself relative to the world around me. Oh, I'm moving too much. But basically, in that previous slide, can I back up the slide somehow?
Oh, yeah. There's a back button on the right.
Oh, this one here?
Oh, the other one.
Oh, this one.
Right one. There.
So if I go back here, for example, the E and the I in the first letter here stands for extroversion or introversion, for example. But basically, think of this as a way in which your energy goes forward, outside of me, or inside. And introverts reinvest inward, and extroverts invest outward. That's the major distinction. Hopefully that makes somewhat sense. And that's the picture, I guess, you could use to conceptualize this. The next part of Jung's theory, though, is the idea of functions. In addition to extroversion, introversion, Jung adds 4 functions. So if extroversion and introversion are the how, or how we perceive the world, the functions are the what. What exactly am I working with? And within these 4 functions, Jung has 2 irrational ones, he calls them, or ones that are just for getting new information. So information about table, for example. This is something I can sense. That's the sensing function. Intuition's a little more complicated, but it has to do with unconscious information. And then once we have this information, we can make decisions with it. And those are the judging functions. So feeling or thinking. That was how Jung, roughly speaking, saw the human psyche, at least in that book. So if I go back quickly, if you look here, for example, all of these different letters refer to those 4 functions, as well as extroversion and introversion, basically. So going forward, basically then, when you combine those 2, because function and orientation go together, you have functions that are oriented in different ways. So if I'm a feeling type, let's say, you can be oriented either introvertedly or extrovertedly with that function. That's how I make sense of reality around me. So each of these functions then allows me to orient myself to the world while also experiencing it in a different way. That's fundamental here. It's not merely behavioral, which I'll get into more. So is everyone with me so far? But basically just think of it as direction plus how I work with reality itself. That's the major thing here. So to give you a better idea of how this works, I'm going to get into these words too, of course. So an extrovert, for example, their dominant function of all of those functions I had in the last slide here would be the top one. That's where most of their priority goes. The second function is meant to compensate for this. So in this case, the auxiliary function or the helping function needs to be the opposite of extroverted because it needs to compensate. Because for Jung, if you're only an extrovert or an introvert purely, you'd be psychopathic. That's unfortunate. Basically, you need to have this counterbalance because everybody needs to have a psychic economy of energy. If it's not organized correctly, that's when you start seeing things like people that have total disconnect from reality, or they're so in reality they don't have an inner life anymore. And those would be pathological states for Jung. So you can see here also that also leaves us though with the inferior function idea, which is that underneath all of what we're comfortable using, there's something we're very uncomfortable using. But that's very important for creating a stable psychic equilibrium. Because for everything in Jung, if there's a thing that's strong, there's a thing that's weak underneath it. And that's how types effectively work, because we're all adapting in different ways. So going forward, hopefully this was somewhat good at explaining this a little bit more. Oh, wait, I went back, sorry. So I want to get a little more into the actual mechanics of what Jung thought these things are doing. Introversion and extroversion literally mean, for example, when you say a naikosha or gaikosha or extrovert or introvert, usually we think of those as terms of someone's more social or less social. For Jung, this is not the case at all. For Jung, it has solely to do with the way your energy goes in or out. So for Jung, an extrovert is someone that justifies himself through the outer world. But for the introvert, the outer world is below his own internal experience. So an introvert can be very talkative, but what matters is the way he prioritizes information. And this is starting to get us into the philosophy of this presentation. Basically, for extroverts and introverts, the world is different in a fundamental way. And I want that to be kind of a platform for what we're going to be getting into. Can I see the time?
10 minutes.
All right, perfect. So basically, this goes over what we were doing previously, but there's an external world and an internal world that everyone has. But if I'm an introvert, I prioritize my relationship to this. And I'm comfortable in here. I'm not comfortable out there. And if you're an extrovert, I'm more comfortable here, but not necessarily here. And comfort's an important word, which we'll get into at the end of this presentation. So in summary so far, types are adaptations to reality. They're adapting. We adapt to reality. If we can't be both for Jung, we need to have a preference in order for reality to make sense to us. I'm not going to get into why he says this because that goes on for 200 pages in the book. But basically, extroverts orient themselves to the world, so like this, and come back. And introverts orient the world to themselves and make sense of the world that way. And then, of course, as I said earlier, in addition to these extroverted introverts, there's feeling, thinking, intuition, and sensation as ways in which I actually deal with the world around me. So what makes Jungian type theory different from modern, let's say, type theories? There's a big one here. As I said earlier, Jung is not a behavioral theorist. So that means you cannot actually verify these with experiments, these types. So for modern science, in many ways, Jung is seen as too abstract, too speculative. He doesn't say enough about the way people really are. So for this reason now, there are theories like the Big Five model, which are actually things that you can detect in people in their behavior. However, on the flip side, Jung therefore is able to say more about maybe the essence of being a human being, because he doesn't only make it verifiable through experimentation. So there's a big distinction there in the way that we're conceiving of the human being. I hope this is somewhat illustrative of what's going on here. These are all things that you can detect in people's behavior and you can say about yourself. So going forward a little more. And that leads us to the question, why did Jung think that types were necessary at all? The reason why is because this. Arg, why can't we agree on anything? Jung was confused. What Jung was saying, we're all people that have a lot of clinical experience, but we have where our theories went opposite directions from each other. So, Jung, Freud, and Adler, Jung saw them as extroverts and introverts, respectively, and that's why they couldn't agree. So unlike the theory here, which only describes behavior, Jung is trying to actually go further and say, why can't people that are very smart agree on things, even when they have the same exact experiences about those things? So these three guys, they all diverged significantly. And they ultimately became enemies, even though they all worked together in the first place. There's some pretty nasty stories in there, so yeah, but a lot of that. And it was pretty ugly during World War II, especially, because yeah, it's a bit sordid story, but anyway, they diverged significantly, and Jung was saying type is one of the reasons why people can't agree on philosophical or psychological arguments. So this is bringing me to the philosophy portion, which won't take too long, don't worry. But basically, type differences for Jung generate rifts in thought. This is the second step of this. So for Jung, a stereotypical, you could say, introverted pattern of thinking is Plato. And for him, an extroverted pattern of thinking is Aristotle, because the way they prioritize either external objects or internal experience more than the other. So for Jung, the reason why they couldn't agree at all is because of type differences. And at the very beginning of his book, this big thick baby right here, he puts an epigraph in there, and the epigraph, or this little story in the beginning, basically says these are two types of people. They're not just having different arguments. They're different souls. They have different ways of looking at reality entirely. And Jung was very moved by these arguments. So for Jung, it's not just about merely saying he talks to people more or he's more quiet. He's trying to say at the bottom of all of us, there's something that makes us fundamentally different, and you can't get away from this. I'm not going to get into the reasons too much today, I'm afraid, but I can do that in Q&A. But going forward a little bit, just to explain this is when we get into a little bit of the dense, abstract philosophy, but to illustrate exactly what Jung means by, I guess you could say, the extrovert matter of thinking, Aristotle was originally Plato's student. And Plato came up with this theory called the world of forms. So let's say if I have this beer can here, right? There's an ideal beer can form that all beer cans share for Plato. And that exists in this separate world of pure ideas. So I don't want to get too deep into that, of course. But the point is that for an introvert like Plato, there's a separate world and it's superior to this world. And because of that world, everything makes sense. So this external world is like the little footnote, a little, who cares about it? What matters is the thing above us for Plato. That's what accounts for his introversion. On the other hand, Aristotle went a different direction. Aristotle said there is no two worlds. There's not this separate world up there in the sky that helps make everything make sense. There's only one world, and it's a combination of form and matter. And that, for Jung, is an extroverted position. Because now I don't have this separate world of beer can that makes all these beer cans. But every instance of beer can, there's no separate world. There's only this current reality in front of us. There's nothing more than that. And for Jung, that's an extroverted perspective. So I hope this makes somewhat sense, because this is definitely very abstract, but it doesn't get more abstract than this, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. But basically, at the same time, as I said earlier, Jung associated Freud with the extroverted position, and he associated Adler, the other psychotherapist, with the introverted position. So going forward a little more. So hang on then. Is there no objective reality then? You can ask this, because if an extrovert and introvert are equally justified in saying certain things, are we entitled to therefore say, if we're Jungians, is there no objective reality? And my answer is, I have no idea. I can't say that. I can't go that far. But I do think that if we think about types in the way Jung wants us to think, it's important to accept that there is uncertainty. That's really valuable, I think, because it gives us something to think about, that maybe reality isn't just what we take it for granted to be. So if I disagree with someone, maybe this is a sign that, maybe I can learn something from them as well, because there's a fundamental disagreement, rather than just saying, you're stupid. No, you're stupid all the time, right? So but that's ironically what happens to smart people like Adler, Freud, and Jung. They just called each other stupid the whole time. Or Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student, and they had a big rupture, to the extent that they didn't really speak to each other anymore, and they insulted each other. And these are smart guys that are responsible for most of what we call the basis of modern philosophy and science as we know it. So it's kind of interesting to think that these smart guys have these disagreements that are so fundamental that they can't ever reconcile. And that's basically what Jung was trying to go for. And that leads me to what's basically the end of my presentation soon, but we can talk about a little bit. That for Jung, getting over these differences or understanding them better was the goal of type theory. Not just in a philosophical sense, but in a personal sense. If I meet someone that's different from me, I can learn something about myself by disagreeing with them. And that was Jung's point. He's trying to say that we differ, but that doesn't mean that we should be enemies. If anything, that means that we should learn from each other. So for example, if I'm one of these types and I meet someone in another type and they bother me because of the way they think, I shouldn't hold it against them. If anything, I should say, well, step back for a second. This is an opportunity for me to grow because I'm annoyed. And Jung was famously quoted as saying that whatever annoys us about other people has to do more with ourselves than them. And this is a line of thinking that goes in here. And even as philosophers, if type has a lot to do with the way we think philosophically, then maybe understanding this can help us become better philosophers as well. And that's something that I believe, as someone that majored in philosophy in university, I find that this model, far from being just a clubhouse mentality of belonging to different types, was actually a very, very fruitful way to understand how we think differently. Because now in today's world, a lot of people use types to say, oh, I belong to this type. Oh, and that means I'm creative, or this. It doesn't work like that. Instead, see type as a way of understanding how you are different relative to other people. And with that, that is my presentation. So I tried to keep it under 20 minutes. Perfect. So yeah, if anybody has questions at this point, I guess we have.
We have 10 minutes
Yeah.
for Q&A. So hey, floor is open.
Yes.
That good.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, very interesting talk. So just to sort of get this right.
Yeah.
According to Jung, then, you like all these orientations, they're not inherent, right? Like, because that's how we adapt to reality. That means depending on your situation,
Yes.
your orientations would change, right?
He's not trying to. He doesn't make a firm argument saying that they're inherited. He's saying there might be parts of your personality that come from other people, but you can easily be influenced in young childhood from a traumatic experience to develop an orientation the other way, for example. Because he's coming out of a Freudian perspective, which makes trauma a big deal. So it's still possible that I can be a person and then have an thank you. I can have some experience that changes. You can't change type later in life, though, he would say. At that point, you're kind of locked in. He also does not believe in what some people call today an ambivert, or something between an introvert and extrovert, because in his theory that doesn't work, because it's always oriented one way or the other, because that's what differentiation is. And every type, we all have types and we all differentiate. So ultimately, deep down, I'm an introvert or an extrovert for Jung. Not for Big Five, which I showed earlier. So
he doesn't think that there's like a level of how we orient ourselves.
Behaviorally, yes. Not typologically.
Not typologically.
Yes. Because there's a difference for them in his book. Yeah. Yes.
Well, actually, I'm a psychotherapist.
Oh, very cool.
I'm very much interested in this
Love it.
thing, but
Yes.
Thank you very much.
do you think we use introvert or extrovert as the translation for Japanese people to be naikoteki, gaikoteki?
No, that's a good question.
Yeah, we use that. But what do you think of this?
I think in a Jungian case, I think that, to be honest, even the common English usage of introvert and extrovert does not apply. When we say extrovert and introvert, we do not really mean it the same way Jung meant it. Because Jung is operating out of a certain philosophical tradition, and those are not just because, oh, I'm social, or I'm not like this. I'm not. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the influx of
What
energy.
You said, it sounds like that was a basic kind of the pattern of the person who communicate with the outer world.
Yes. It has to do with, to use a big word, it has to do with, for Jung, the subject called phenomenology, which is basically how things appear to me. By being an extrovert or an introvert, reality in some ways fundamentally constructed differently. Even if that reality is the same beneath that, we have a very fundamental bias. That's what he's trying to argue.
And also, I'm very much interested in all those three big people, big guys.
Yeah, they are big guys.
psychotherapists.
Big guys, yeah.
So what is kind of way of thinking change their, their way of being psychotherapists or making a psychotherapy?
Jung's argument, I'm just going to go into this slightly because you study psychotherapy, so you know the theories of these guys. So Alfred Adler is famous, of course, for prioritizing the feelings of inferiority in a therapeutic environment. Jung associated that with introversion, as an introvert would make this theory. Of course, the funny part is he actually backpedals on Adler, because Adler was a very extroverted person in real life. So he just said in his theory, he's making theories that seem to come from a position of introverts, of an introvert seeing feelings of inferiority as holding me back. Whereas for Freud, childhood trauma, some actually existent thing, and my relationship to my mother and the Oedipal complex is what causes neurosis. So he was saying, hey, these guys have this difference. That's basically what he's saying. Of course, he starts the book with Plato and Aristotle, though. So that's a big thing, I would say. Like, this is literally the first page of the book is him talking about these two guys. So, you know, and if anyone knows, Aristotle's pointing down because he's referring to the world. Plato is pointing up because he's referring to the world of forms. Which is, so, and this is from the famous painting by Raphael in the Sistine Chapel, I believe. And I could be wrong about this, or St. Peter's, I don't know.
So my final question is, what you said was so interesting for me, but it's very difficult to understand in this tiny minute.
Yeah, of course.
So what do you recommend for reading?
Well, if you need, you should read this. I mean, this book is basically but this book is like, it has all the problems of Jung's writing. There's a lot of erudition or knowledge that's irrelevant. Like if I cut this book down in half, it would be perfectly fine. But he was like, he starts talking about Buddhism, all of a sudden Hinduism, Japanese philosophy. He's like, yeah, these are all types, and he doesn't explain himself ever. So you're just like, so you get to the end, like, what did I just read? You're asking yourself that. You get to the appendix, and it's all the definitions, like, that's what I was looking for the whole time. So then you get to the appendix, you're like, finally, I can now understand what he wrote in the previous 400 pages. So, but this is an interesting book, but go into it with maybe a mind that's too open. Because if you go in with a mind that's like, you're just gonna throw this out the window. It's infuriating to read sometimes. Not as infuriating as some philosophers, mind you, but it's pretty infuriating. But yeah. So.
Yeah, thank you.
No, of course. Thank you for asking. Yes.
What about like today with counterculture or cancel culture?
Yeah.
Would that be more introvert or extrovert?
I don't think
Does
Jung
it
would think of it
relate?
that way. I think he would at that point you would start getting into if we see, for example, if we see cancel culture as overreactive in some way in a psychotherapeutic, a psychoanalytic sense.
Yeah.
You would say there's some societal issue beneath that has nothing to do with counterculture that's being compensated for with counterculture.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say that an extrovert and introvert could both be proponents or opponents of counterculture, right? I don't think Jung would associate with one way or the other. Maybe he would associate with the feeling function if he thought that it was more based on feelings rather than thoughts, which is the thinking function.
Right.
But I wouldn't say that there's an extroverted introverted bias in there.
Okay.
Is what I would say.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. We have some time left, so 4 minutes if anyone wants to. Oh, please.
Maybe you mentioned this.
Mhm.
Who came up with these terms, like introvert and extrovert?
Jung did.
Okay, he wrote in English?
Yeah, no, he wrote in German.
And that would.
But yeah, but this I don't read German, so I'm
Yeah,
just
that's,
gonna
I was
translate.
just curious about that.
So,
okay.
but basically, he came up with the terms as they're applied there.
Okay.
But before him, in the fledgling science of psychology, there was these gradual ideas like introversion and extroversion, but they weren't used in the way that modern psychology uses them.
Okay.
Jung is very much responsible for popularizing this new way of looking at them. And that became what we know as introvert and extrovert today largely. So, yeah. Sorry, did anyone? Oh, yeah.
Is there any reason, or I guess could you explain a little bit why there couldn't be a balance between a certain function being primary or secondary, or it being introverted or extroverted?
Yeah, so basically, because Jung is not a behavioral psychotherapist, he believes that types are fundamental in some way to structuring reality. It's not that just I'm in between two, but remember, if we go back to the theory of cognitive functions, we ultimately are always orienting ourselves to reality in a certain way. If we behave in a way that seems to be both, it might be because we have a well-developed auxiliary function, for example. So, but ultimately for Jung, there's no such thing as an ambivert. That terminology is more behavioral, like someone that likes to spend time alone at home, but also likes to go out and party sometimes. He wouldn't see that as definitive for a type assessment. What's definitive for a type assessment is primarily how you perceive reality, and this is related to Kantian metaphysics, and I'm not going to get into that too much, but basically you can't really be between two types. You are a type, and you have an orientation. He goes into depth about this in the book, and it has to do with the history of human sociology, and it's he basically says that in the past, in ancient Greece, for example, or primitive societies, Jung puts it that way, he says that there's less differentiation of all of these. There's more of this primordial soup of functions. That means that people in those cultures, for Jung, he was in that time frame, are more susceptible to kind of bleeding these all together. But as society required a differentiated function for us to function in a society, he said that types became a necessity of adapting. So we have no choice but to have this, whether we like it or not. That's what Jung somewhat argues in this book. But he doesn't really argue. He just kind of says stuff. And you just kind of read, and you're like, all right. He's not a very good arguer. He just likes to say random stuff.
So does Jung have any idea about how that evolves into a one person?
He has a lot of ideas. Yeah. Too many ideas.
Yeah. So from the beginning, the DNA is written like that, or certain person grows and learns to be that way?
Yeah, I think in society, the thing is, I didn't get into all the other Jungian theories, which might be the collective unconscious and all this, which also plays a role in this. But effectively, society, at least in the Western world, required the development, he says very much through Christianity, actually, Christianity kind of created a platform for human beings to become more what we call the modern West. It required this. So that's why in like what he calls primitive societies, these functions are very much mixed together, and there's not really differentiation. Differentiation is an important idea I didn't get to today, but Jung made a big deal about it. So,
Did Jung attribute the development of Western society to the emergence of these different functions? Or
These functions always exist, but insofar as they're functional for the human subject, they took on the role of functions as they differentiated. At first, though, these were just feeling, sensing, intuition, and thinking. We're all mixed together. So, like, you have visions and you say, like, this is something that's important.
Yeah.
But today, we organize these and use one that we're strongest with. Whereas in the past, these might have been much more dispersed between people. There wasn't as much of a conscious need to differentiate between these functions. But that's not the way it is today. Now we have a modern society. You need to fulfill a role within that society. That's why differentiation became important. So that's kind of his argument. So society goes hand in hand with this. It's not like one causes the other, but he says religion has a big thing to do with this actually, or big societally motivating factors.
Okay.
So like Christianity might have had a big role in the way humanity developed, for example, or big religious movements. Yeah. So, no.
No, sorry, I was just scratching my
Yeah,
head.
we had
I think
10
we're done.
minutes, so I was just making sure.
Yeah, well, you'll stick around, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if you have any more questions, please ask. But please,
Yeah.
for now, give a round of applause.
Thank you very much.